Thousands of years before anyone in a laboratory tested it, the ancient Egyptians already believed this spiny little animal carried a kind of protection against snakebite. For most of history, that belief sat filed away as pure superstition, right next to the old claim that hedgehogs spear fallen fruit onto their spines, like tiny market carts to haul back to their den. Except modern research has actually confirmed part of it. Inside hedgehog muscle tissue is a protein researchers eventually named erinacin, and in laboratory testing it neutralizes the tissue-destroying effects of venom from at least 10 different snake species. This is not folklore dressed up to sound scientific. It is a real, isolated compound identified in a peer-reviewed toxinology journal sitting in the blood of an animal most people only ever notice as a spiky nuisance under the hedge, if they notice it at all. The strange part is not that the ancient belief turned out to have something to it. The strange part is that it took science until the very end of the 20th century to catch up to what a civilization, thousands of years earlier, had already worked out, without a microscope in sight, and without any way to prove it beyond watching the animal survive things that should have killed it. That gap is where this story actually starts. And by the end, you will understand exactly what that ancient belief was pointing at all along. Hedgehogs have been woven into human belief for a remarkably long time, and the oldest thread runs through ancient Egypt. Egyptians associated the animal with rebirth, likely because it appears to vanish underground for the winter and then re-emerge, alive, once the cold breaks, a cycle that looked a great deal like death and resurrection to anyone watching it happen year after year. Tied into that same cluster of belief was the idea that the hedgehog carried a natural immunity to snake venom, a claim that had no scientific backing at the time and simply persisted as folk knowledge, repeated and passed down without anyone able to explain why it might be true. The Greeks and Romans picked up the thread in their own way, though on a different subject entirely. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote that hedgehogs could predict a change in the wind, claiming that even hedgehogs kept indoors would shift position from one wall to another as the weather turned. He even mentioned a man in Constantinople who built a personal reputation as a reliable weather forecaster purely by watching his pet hedgehog's movements around the house, never once admitting to his neighbors where the information actually came from. Pliny the Elder, writing a few centuries later in his Natural History, added a different detail entirely, describing hedgehogs climbing into vineyards, shaking grapes loose, and then rolling on the fallen fruit to spear it onto their spines and carry it home for winter storage. It is a wonderful image, and it survived in illustrated bestiary after bestiary across the medieval period, copied and recopied for well over 1,000 years. It also, as far as modern naturalists can tell, never actually happens. We will come back to that. What matters most for this story is the Egyptian claim, because centuries later, a small community of toxinologists went looking for exactly the kind of biochemical mechanism that could explain it. The researcher whose name ended up attached to the discovery was Dietrich Mebs, and his work would finally give the old belief a name grounded in actual molecular biology, one that had been slowly building since at least the 1980s in labs most people never heard of. The first real biochemical evidence came in 1987, when researchers DeWitt and Westrom, publishing in the journal Toxicon, identified macroglobulin proteins in hedgehog plasma capable of neutralizing hemorrhagic venom activity, though at that stage the exact protein responsible had not been fully pinned down. In 1996, Dietrich Mebs and his colleagues isolated and fully characterized the specific protein responsible, publishing their findings in Toxicon under the name erinacin. It is a large molecule with a molecular weight of roughly 1 million, which puts it on a completely different scale than most venom-neutralizing compounds identified in other resistant animals. Erinacin works by blocking the hemorrhagic enzymes in snake venom, the components responsible for rupturing blood vessels and causing internal bleeding, and testing showed it effective against venom from at least 10 snake species, including the European adder, the actual predator hedgehogs are most likely to encounter in the wild, and remarkably, the Brazilian jararaca, a snake from an entirely different continent and an entirely different evolutionary lineage, with no shared recent ancestry to the adder at all. It is worth being precise about what this protection actually is, because it is not full immunity. A German study published in 1909 documented 2 hedgehogs that died within a few hours after being bitten by an adder directly on the head. A reminder that erinacin blunts the damage rather than eliminating the risk entirely, particularly when the bite lands somewhere the protein can't fully do its job. Even with that caveat, a hedgehog bitten on the body has a real biochemical defense that most mammals simply don't have. One strong enough that adders are rarely a serious threat to an adult hedgehog in the wild. Hedgehogs are not alone in this. A 2022 review published in Biological Reviews examined convergent evolution of venom resistance across the animal kingdom and placed the hedgehog alongside the opossum, the honey badger, and several other unrelated species, each of which independently evolved its own version of the same basic trick, neutralizing venom through completely different molecular pathways that happen to arrive at a similar outcome. Which raises the obvious question of why an animal carrying a genuinely rare biological defense is still the one getting shooed out of gardens with a broom, or worse. Here's what actually changes once you understand what's curled up under your hedge, and what the correct way to help it looks like, according to groups like the RSPCA and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, who study this at scale, and who have real reason to be worried. Hedgehog numbers in the United Kingdom have fallen below 1 million, down by around 30% in just over a decade. And conservationists treat the species as an indicator, meaning its decline says something troubling about the broader health of garden and hedgerow ecosystems, not just about hedgehogs themselves. Start with movement, because it's the single biggest problem hedgehogs face in modern neighborhoods. An adult hedgehog can travel 1 to 4 kilometers in a single night, searching for food, water, and mates, ranging across 10 to 20 hectares, which means it needs to move freely between multiple gardens, not just yours. Solid fencing blocks that completely. The fix is a hedgehog highway, a small gap cut at ground level in a fence or gate. One gap connects your garden to the next, and if a whole street does it, you've effectively restored a corridor that modern fencing quietly destroyed one garden at a time. Next is food and water, and this is where good intentions go wrong most often. Leave out meaty cat or dog food, or a specialist hedgehog food, along with fresh water in a shallow dish, refreshed daily. Never put out milk or bread. Hedgehogs are lactose intolerant, and milk can give them severe diarrhea, while bread offers essentially no nutritional value at all. It is one of the most common, well-meaning mistakes people make, repeated for generations, and it's worth correcting deliberately, rather than assuming the old advice still holds. Leave a genuinely wild corner if you can, a log pile, some leaf litter, a patch of longer grass. That does double duty, providing shelter and hibernation space while also hosting the beetles, worms, and slugs hedgehogs actually eat, which means a hedgehog-friendly corner is also a natural ongoing form of pest control for the rest of your garden. Finally, a few safety checks that cost nothing but a moment's attention. Before lighting a bonfire, physically move the entire pile by hand rather than just lighting it where it stands, since hedgehogs regularly nest inside unlit wood piles and can't escape once it catches. Before strimming or mowing, check the area first and cut high, then low, to reduce the chance of injury to anything hiding in the grass. Skip slug pellets and garden chemicals entirely, since they're directly poisonous to hedgehogs, not just the slugs they're aimed at. And if you have a garden pond, make sure there's a ramp or a sloped edge, so a hedgehog that falls in can climb back out rather than drown. Erinacin protects a hedgehog against an adder bite. It does nothing at all against a strimmer, a sealed fence, or a bowl of milk left out with the best of intentions, which is exactly why the practical side of this matters just as much as the biology. Here's the detail that surprises people who already know the venom story. Hedgehogs perform a behavior researchers call self-anointing, and it looks genuinely bizarre if you've never seen it happen. When a hedgehog encounters a new, strong-smelling substance, sometimes a toad's skin secretion, sometimes something as ordinary as a cigarette butt or a strongly scented plant, it will chew or lick the source, work up a thick froth of saliva, and then twist its body into an almost impossible contortion to spread that foamy saliva across its own spines using its tongue. Researchers have documented this behavior for decades and still don't have a fully settled explanation for why it happens. One leading theory is that hedgehogs are deliberately transferring toxins from other animals, toad skin secretions in particular, onto their own spines, essentially borrowing a chemical weapon rather than manufacturing one internally the way erinacin works inside their own blood. Compare that to the old Pliny the Elder story about hedgehogs spearing grapes and apples onto their spines to haul home for winter. It's a charming image, and it survived in illustrated bestiaries for well over 1,000 years, repeated as established natural history by writer after writer who never actually watched a hedgehog do it. But there's no solid modern evidence that hedgehogs actually behave this way at all. What they really do with their spines is stranger and better documented than the myth ever was, coating themselves in foam made from the toxins of other animals for reasons science still hasn't fully nailed down, even now. The real behavior didn't need any exaggeration to be worth knowing. It just needed someone patient enough to watch closely and notice it. Think back to that ancient Egyptian belief held by people who never once looked through a microscope and yet correctly guessed that this animal carried something unusual in its body. That guess sat unexplained for thousands of years, dismissed by anyone who wanted hard evidence before believing it, until a molecule with a name, erinacin, finally caught up to it in 1996. The hedgehog you might find curled up under a hedge tonight carries that same unexplained advantage in its blood. A real, laboratory-tested resistance to the venom of at least 10 snake species, built up over a far longer stretch of time than anyone watching it in ancient Egypt could have known. What it doesn't carry any resistance to is a sealed garden fence, a bowl of milk meant kindly, or a strimmer moving through long grass without a check first. Those are entirely human problems, invented far more recently than any snake ever was, and they're also entirely solvable. So here's the small, doable thing. Cut a small gap at the base of one fence panel, or simply leave out a shallow dish of water tonight instead of nothing at all. It costs almost nothing, and it addresses the actual danger this animal faces now, the one no amount of ancient venom resistance was ever built to handle.